As with all my videos dealing on foreign topics, foreign people, and foreign areas and foreign terms altogether, all pronunciations will be Americanized. The life and times of Juan Domingo Perón. Perón was born in 1895 and died in 1974 at the age of 78. For this video, we'll be using the book Juan Domingo Perón, A History by Robert J. Alexander, amongst other Peronist writings. The country, Argentina, did not change substantially during the first generation of independence, which occurred in the second decade of the 19th century. During much of that time, it was ruled by a collection of caudillos, provincial despots, the most outstanding of whom was Juan Manuel de Rosas, the tyrant of the province of Buenos Aires, as he was called. For all practical purposes, a national government did not even exist much of that time. It was not until after the overthrow of Rosas in 1852 that the country began to achieve national unity and to be transformed economically and socially. The formation of a single nation was only achieved after two short civil wars between Buenos Aires and the rest of the country. As the land was taken from the Indians, it was given by successive governments to new white and mestizo landlords. In theory, the land was apportioned largely among those who had fought in the wars against the Indians, the amount of land each person received being dependent on his rank in the military or his influence with the political powers. In practice, most subordinate personnel had no resources with which to develop the land given to them, and they tended to sell it to the larger guarantees. As a result, by the 1860s, most of the great fertile Pampa Belt centering Buenos Aires had been divided among a relatively small number of very large landowners. Much of the same happened farther south in Patagonia, which also was wrested from control of the Indians. From the 1860s on, deliberate government policy, aided by important technological developments, transformed the economy and society of Argentina. A series of presidents in the period of the 1860s through the 1880s sought to develop the agricultural and grazing potentialities of the Pampas and Patagonia. To this end, they encouraged the building of railroads capable of transporting meat and grains to principal ports of Buenos Aires and Rosario. At the same time, the national leaders sought to modernize these and other important cities, providing them with the infrastructures the changing nature of economy required. These presidents also sought to Europeanize their country. One of them, Domingo Sarmiento, had eloquently expressed this philosophy in Facundo, his study of one of the caudillos of the earlier period, subtitled Civilization and Barbarism. For Sarmiento, Europe and its influences were clearly civilization, and the indigenous American culture was barbarism. The immigrants to Argentina were faced with conditions that were strikingly different from those facing their counterparts in the United States. By the time they began to arrive in Argentina, the country's rich land had already been divided into great estates, and it was not possible for most of them to set up their own rural homesteads. So we're just giving a quick overlap of the modern Argentinian history and how it came about into being its own state, and also probably why within like the 100 years of it there's probably like 30 to 40 overthrows of government that took place. Thus the immigrants either worked on the large estates or settled down in the cities, where they became petty merchants, artisans, construction workers, and the like. The only part of the country where immigrants were able to establish family farms was the northeast, in the province of Santa Fe, and others to the north. Even there, however, the immigrant farmers became tenant farmers more often than they became landowners. So we're seeing money interests buy up a lot of land and essentially renting it out to farmers and whoever else is a large part of this creation of the Argentinian state. The economy that developed after 1860 was based essentially upon the cultivation of the grain and the production of meat for export to Europe, particularly to Great Britain. Several factors stimulated this kind of economic development, aside from the deliberate policies of successive Argentine governments and the entrepreneurial spirit of the new class of large landowners. By repealing the Corn Laws in 1846, Great Britain made a deliberate decision to concentrate on the production of manufactured goods and to depend on the trade to obtain food products that would no longer be produced at home. Argentina was one of several countries whose economy benefited from the British decision. Two technological developments were also of great importance to the expansion of the Argentine export economy. The first of these was the invention of barbed wire, which made it possible to fence off part of the pampas and, through careful breeding of the scrawny native cattle with prize animals brought in from Europe, to develop a kind of beast capable of providing the beef favored by the English consumers. The second development was the discovery of ways to chill and freeze meat. This made it possible to slaughter cattle and sheep in Argentina and ship meat across the Atlantic in refrigerated vessels, rather than shipping live cattle, which lost much of their weight in overseas passages. Much of the development of the economy in this period was brought about by the introduction of large amounts of foreign capital, principally from Britain, but also from France, Germany, and the United States. Thus, although the Argentine provinces built the first railroads, the job of developing a modern transportation system was soon turned over to British and French investors. The pre-World War Argentine economy was a very dependent one. It hinged on the production of large quantities of a small variety of products to export to foreign, principally European, markets. At the same time, much of the infrastructure of the expanding economy was in the hands of firms that had their head offices in London, Paris, Chicago, rather than Buenos Aires or Rosario. Although the export-oriented economy was very dependent for its prosperity on foreign demand for its goods and on the continuing flow of capital and people from other lands, it laid the groundwork for the development of another less dependent kind of economy. The failure of Argentine governments and entrepreneurs to develop this kind of complementary aspect of the economy generated the crisis the country faced by the 1930s and 40s that prepared the way for Juan Domingo Perón, a man who, in his own way, tried to deal with the crisis. In a word, the next rational stage in the development of the Argentine economy was that of import substitution industrialization. For a generation or more, Argentina did not take that step for industrialization. The government of that period, when they were not hostile to industrialization, were at best neutral on the subject. They were not willing to foster the growth of an industrial sector. The reasons for this were clear. Until 1916, the government was completely in the hands of political elements allied with large landowners, whose economic well-being was completely associated with the export trade. The landowners, of course, were quite happy with the kind of economy that Argentina had during this period, as they were its chief beneficiaries. However, not only were the material interests of this class closely associated with the continuation of export trade as the focus of Argentine economy, but the landowners were also very closely tied emotionally and culturally to the British, Argentina's best customers. The Argentine landowning class, it is clear, had no desire to do anything that might interfere with the export economy, which served them so handsomely. They feared that any attempt to foster an industrial sector of the Argentine economy might bring about reprisals from the British, who might seek other sources of meat and grain. So once again, the bourgeois class only looking out for its own interest at the expense of everyone else. The Ottawa Conference adopted a system of imperial preferences whereby members of the empire agreed to trade with one another on preferential terms, charging lower tariffs on goods from within the empire than were levied on those coming in from countries outside of the empire. Argentina, although she may have been economically a part of the British Empire, did not politically belong to it. Therefore, the Argentine economy ran scared throughout the 1930s in the face of the threat represented by the imperial preference system. As a result, the Argentine administrations of that period engaged in prodigies of obeisance to the British. They succeeded in getting their partial exception from the imperial preference systems for themselves. However, in return, they went far out of their way to give favorable terms to British investors, to assure the British of a completely open market for their manufactured goods in the Argentine market, and to make it clear to them that they had no intention of allowing Argentina to be industrialized. Argentina was at first badly hit by the Great Depression. Her exports and the prices diminished. As a result, there was a shortage of foreign exchange, and the country could not continue to import the same wide range of manufactured goods as had been its custom. As a result, although the Argentine government took no steps to provide protection for industry, the Great Depression did in spite of the government. Until June 4, 1943, the government of Argentina continued to be hostile to the idea of industrialization. It blindly refused to see that if the country's economy was going to continue to progress, it would have to do so in the direction of developing a large manufacturing sector. Frank recognition of this fact was one of the contributions Juan Domingo Perón made to Argentina. As the working class grew in numbers, it also tended to grow in class consciousness. Starting in the 1880s, the organized labor movement came into existence. Railroad workers, port employees, ship repairmen, printers, and a variety of other kinds of workers began to establish unions. The governments of the time gave little encouragement to the new labor movement. Indeed, the conservative regime in power before 1916 tended to look upon the labor movement as subversive and to react very strongly against it. Laws were passed permitting the government arbitrarily to deport any foreign-born labor leaders who aroused its fear or indignation. Strikes were frequently broken by the police and even occasionally by the army. The era of the anarchist domination over organized labor was superseded by a period in which the socialists were the most important group. The union leaders came to be seen as administrators of activities for the workers, but the rank and file took an increasingly small role in union affairs. Attendance at union meetings declined, and in other ways, as well as the average union member was less actively involved in what its organization was doing. The communists alone made considerable effort to reach them, achieving marked success among the construction workers but organizing very feeble unions in other areas, such as the new metal and chemical industries and the older packing house sector. It was among these new industrial workers that Juan Perón was able to find his most fanatical and loyal supporters. By the 1940s, Argentina was notoriously backward among the Latin American countries in terms of labor and social legislation. In the two preceding decades, most of the other countries of the area, particularly the larger ones, had passed extensive labor codes providing systems of social security and extensive regulation of working conditions. They also provided legal recognition for labor unions and employers' organizations, and established the means for collective bargaining between them. Argentina had little of this. Therefore, the situation was ripe for the appearance of someone who, by bringing about the enactment of extensive labor laws, could win the support of the workers, both organized and unorganized. Yet the forces that controlled Argentina, both economically and politically, showed no desire to stimulate industrialization. In fact, they were generally hostile to the idea. Nor did the governments of Argentina during the interwar period show any inclination to deal with the problems of the large urban working class created by the export economy and the industrialization that had naturally taken place. These two problems gave Juan Domingo Perón his chance. So, as typical, the ruling classes are putting themselves over the people, making decisions for the country based on their own personal profit, as opposed to the well-being of the working class majority. Okay, let's get into a little bit of Perón's background and youth, since we just covered the background and youth of Argentina. Juan Domingo Perón was born on October 8, 1895, in the provincial town of Lobo in the province of Buenos Aires, about 60 miles south of the national capital. Juan Perón was of Italian descent on his father's side. The name Peroni, spelled P-E-R-O-N-I, or Peroni, P-E-R-O-N-E, is fairly common in Italy. One of the most popular beers in the Naples region bears the Peroni name. Juan Perón's great-grandfather is said to have been an Italian senator from the island of Sardinia. His mother is said to have been of partly American Indian descent. At the age of 16, Perón was admitted to the National Military Academy. He perhaps went there as much because this was a good way for a boy of modest means to get a government-paid education, as for any other reason. The military academy had been established several decades earlier by a German military mission, and its faculty still contained a number of German members when Perón was a student there. The 1930s opened with the overthrow of the government of Hipólito by a military/civilian coup led by Uriburu. This was the first time since the 1860s that Argentine armed forces had ousted the government, but it was to be the beginning of an almost ceaseless process of making and unmaking regimes by the military. Since 1930, only 2 elected presidents have fulfilled their constitutional terms of office. And one of them was Perón fulfilling his first term, but he was ousted in the second one. The revolution of 1930, however, was not only a military operation. It had the participation and support of most of the civilian political parties which were opposed to the government. The 1930 revolution was of immense significance for the future of Argentina, and Juan Perón had an active although minor part in it. Still a captain, he is said to have commanded a part of the military group that seized control of the presidential palace and the streets around it on September 6th. Now, around these times, Perón had also spent a few years in Europe learning with their allies in Germany and Italy, and was highly influenced by what he saw going on, especially with Mussolini and Italian fascism. He actually believed that the Axis was going to win in World War II and was favorable to them until the point that they figured out they weren't going to win. And this is to be said where he first started gaining his understanding of third position politics. Now let's get into the GOU, which stands for the Group of United Officers. This was a little crew within the military, a little coup d'etat crew. Upon returning to Argentina in 1941 from his time in Europe, Colonel Juan Perón was assigned to work with the Argentine ski troops stationed at Mendoza in the Adrian Sea. In March 1942, he was transferred to the Inspectorate of Mountain Troops in Buenos Aires. There he became involved in a very important extra official activity, participation in the establishment of the GOU. 7 officers, including Perón, began promoting the idea of an establishment of a lodge early in 1942. They won recruits to the idea, principally among staff officers in and near Buenos Aires. They also elected a directorate of 20 officers. These included 3 full colonels, 3 lieutenant colonels, 3 majors, and a captain. The last of these was Captain Francisco Filippi, private secretary to the War Minister, General Pedro Ramirez, obviously a man with a strategic post in military hierarchy. Castillo himself, Castillo was the president at the time, had reached the presidency as an indirect result of fraudulent elections. In 1938, he had been the candidate for vice president of the political alliance known as the Concordancia, consisting of the conservatives, National Democrats, anti-personalista radicals, and the remnants of the independent socialists. This coalition that had run the country together with the armed forces since the revolution of 1930 had maintained itself in powers by means of what its participants referred to as patriotic fraud. When President Roberto Ortiz, elected in 1938, fell ill 3 years later, Vice President Castillo took over, first as acting president, and then when Ortiz died in 1942 as President of the Republic. Castillo was widely unpopular. He had governed under a state of siege, he proclaimed, while only acting president. Much of the plotting was taking place May 1943. The GOU reached a decision to attempt a coup d'etat in September to prevent the election. Its basic proposition was that the Axis was going to win the war, and and as a result, the world would be divided into a number of spheres of influence. The alleged GOU statement went on to argue that in association with the victorious Axis, Argentina was the logical country to dominate South America. The principal rival for this role would be Brazil, and to isolate Brazil, it was Argentina's task to form alliances with all of the countries surrounding her and to force the Brazilians to recognize the hegemony of the Argentina-led group. Rapid changes in the fortunes of World War II soon made this view of the world obsolete. The Russian victory at Stalingrad, followed by the long and bloody retreat of the German armies from their high watermark in the Soviet Union, the Western Allies' victory in North Africa and the landings in Western Europe, and the progress of American island hopping campaign in the Pacific all tilted the balance against the Axis. At 47 years of age, he was a man whose career had been within the armed forces. He was virtually unknown outside of the military. Perón was physically attractive, tall for an Argentinian, and solidly built. He had sleek black hair and a ruddy complexion. Among those who knew him, he was regarded as being a good-humored, not overly serious, and somewhat boastful, although not irritatingly so. It was known that he had been very upset by the death of his wife, and was not regarded particularly as a womanizer. Perón was married 3 times. His first wife, who died at the young age of 30 due to cancer, they were married and she died years before Perón would come into power. At that point, Perón apparently had not given any strong indication of the abilities that were soon to rocket him to the dominant place in national politics. His undoubted oratorical abilities were as yet untried, at least outside the small circle of military associates. His capacity for intrigue and political maneuver was as yet unproven. His ability to win undying loyalty from some and undying hatred from others was as yet undemonstrated. So no overtly recognizable wanting of power, at least yet. I mean, as his life plays out, you see he's essentially put into a right position, and then maybe start seeing through the opportunities he has, that he has a chance to use the circumstances and his position to bring himself into power, which is eventually what he did. Let's get into the June 4th coup. The military move to take over the government was provoked immediately by President Castillo's attempt to force the resignation of Minister of War General Pedro Ramirez. Leaders of the armed forces regarded Castillo's move as absolute confirmation of his intention to impose his choice for a successor and to make the military cooperate with him in the effort. Several factors made the armed forces leaders oppose strongly the imposition of Patron Costas, who was going to be the replacement president, as the successor to President Castillo. Perón himself told me that their most important motivation was their extreme dislike for what the military men saw as Patron Costas' extreme conservatism. There was also certainly strong objection to the idea of being used once more to enforce the choice of a president by fraudulent elections. In addition, no doubt many of the pro-Axis officers, specifically among the colonels and lower ranks, were against Patron Costas because, as one of the country's largest landowners, he was presumed to be pro-British in the war. In addition, he cited contacts with German officers in the Argentine Military Academy and noted that during the late 1930s, when he and other Argentine officers had been guests of the Italian and German armed forces, they had been treated with respect and friendship. On the morning of June 3rd, the president ordered the preparation of a decree deposing General Ramirez as war minister. Word of this spread very quickly in the ranks of the officer corps. General Ramirez himself gave his private secretary, member of the GOU, permission to try to do something about the matter, but said that he would remain neutral. As a result, by that evening, contact had been established among 3 separate groups: the GOU, a number of generals and admirals, led by the Chief of Cavalry, General Arturo Rawson, who had their own conspiracy afoot against Castillo, and the principal officers of the Campo de Mayo garrison just outside Buenos Aires, who also had been talking about the need to remove the president. Starting at 10 p.m. on the night of June 3, 14 officers, all colonels and lieutenant colonels, with the exception of General Rawson, met at the cavalry school at the Campo de Mayo garrison and planned the movement which overthrew President Castillo the next day. Notably absent were Colonel Juan Domingo Perón and his close friend and hierarchical superior, General Farrell. Perón was not seen by the conspirators until late the following day, when it was clear that the coup d'etat had been successful. However, he had sent a proclamation explaining the reasons for the movement to the meeting and was unanimously accepted. Most of the time at the meeting was taken up with the technical details of the proposed march on Buenos Aires. There apparently was little or no programmatic discussions, and it would appear that there had not even been a firm understanding as to who would succeed Ramon Castillo as president. Some took for granted that it would be General Ramirez, others that it would be General Rawson, who in fact led the rebellious troops into the capital. A force of 10,000 men marched on Buenos Aires. They met little opposition except a small naval station where there was some fighting and a number of casualties on both sides. They took the presidential palace with ease, although President Castillo had already fled to a naval craft, from which he disembarked once the victory of the rebellion was clear. On June 4th, President Castillo formally submitted his resignation. The first person to take over the presidency was General Arturo Rawson. However, within 48 hours, he was forced out of the office by the colonels who had brought about the coup because of disagreements over his cabinet appointments. His place was taken by General Pedro Ramirez. The key Ministry of War post was given to General Farrell, who before the coup had been Perón's immediate superior. He was a man without great ability to maneuver or great interest in ideas, and he seemed to have had boundless respect for these characteristics in Perón. General Farrell gave Colonel Perón the second position in the ministry, making him its secretary. During the months that followed, the GOU and Perón plotted to get a dominant position in the military government. They sought to place their own people in positions of the troop command and sought to maneuver people who were hostile to them out of military posts that were of strategic importance. Allied pressure finally convinced President Pedro Ramirez of the necessity formally to break diplomatic relations with the Axis powers. This action provoked a three-sided struggle among those generals and more junior officers who supported the Ramirez move. Nationalistic pro-Axis people who were opposed both to Ramirez's action and the growing influence of Perón, and Perón and his close associates. Although Perón was willing to go along with the break with the Axis, he succeeded in avoiding any blame for the move. The result of this crisis was an almost total reorganization of the military government. President Ramirez resigned, and Perón's friend, General Farrell, took his place. At the same time, Perón himself became vice president and minister of war without relinquishing his post as Secretary of Labor and Social Welfare, which he had assumed a few months before. Subsequently, he was to acquire a fourth post as head of post-war council. So while all of these quick regime changes are going on, the parliament has been officially shut down. Many worker groups are being suppressed. A lot of totalitarian measures are taking place. And this is building resentment, and this is eventually what Perón would cash in on. We go on. Perón and his closest associates had soon become worried about the growing alienation of the regime from the civilian population. They feared that the military government would not be able to last long if it did not fairly rapidly gain allies among at least some civilian elements. So Perón and his friends turned to the labor movement, which in the face of the past seemed a highly unlikely source for which to gain support for the military regime. Discussions finally were arranged between Perón and his friends and a number of union leaders. The military men sounded out the labor leaders concerning their complaints about previous administrations and the things that the organized labor movement wanted from the government. The most that the trade unionists would promise was to show public approval for governmental acts they considered pro-labor, and public condemnation for those they felt to be in opposition to workers' interests. These discussions formed the background for some of the changes in government policy inaugurated in the last months of 1943, particularly those changes which brought to Juan Domingo Perón a wide civilian backing. Juan Perón was named the first Secretary of Labor and Social Welfare. During the next 2 years, Juan Perón made the most of the possibilities presented to him by this new post. His activities in this field included the enactment of a great deal of social legislation, the stimulation of growth of the organized labor movement, and increasing intervention in the process of collective bargaining. During the 1943 to 1945 period, a very large amount of labor and social legislation was enacted by the military government. This included laws extending Social Security, principally health insurance and retirement benefits, to virtually all parts of the working class. Laws concerning paid vacations and holidays, labor inspection, limitation of the employer's rights to dismiss workers, and a wide variety of other matters. From being a country notable for the paucity of its labor and social legislation, Argentina was converted into one of the most advanced governments in this respect. Each of these decree laws bore the name of Perón as Secretary of Labor and Social Welfare. So he's already outshining the president because it's his name that's attached to all of these worker reform laws, and for good reason, because it was him that was meeting with the unions and putting these things forward. Furthermore, even more important was his leadership in breaking down the resistance of employers groups who for a generation or more had frustrated all efforts of their workers to unionize, and had steadfastly refused to bargain with those that did. Especially in the industrial ring around Buenos Aires, Perón forced employers to recognize and bargain with unions among the packing house workers, the metal workers, and in Heathrow, unorganized parties of textile industry. And so now even these workers who didn't have union power or collective power, like the sugar workers, the winery workers, a lot of the warehouse workers, were all starting to get unionized under the moves Perón was doing. Perón did not limit his efforts to encouraging the organization of the workers to an increasing degree. He and his secretariat intervened in the collective bargaining process itself, generally in a way to force substantial concessions from the employers. Indeed, in particularly important cases, it became the custom for Perón himself to preside at the ceremony of signing collective agreements. The workers soon got the impression that Perón intended them to get. It was he who was responsible for the collective agreements and the improvements they brought about, not the union or employee representatives. One of the most important of these was the concept of the descamisados, the shirtless ones. Although Perón began earlier to refer to workers as descamisados, the word came to be symbolized by his appearing in front of groups of workers in his shirt sleeves. There is no doubt about the fact that they thought they were using Perón to gain advantages for their members, the union leaders. And at least at first, they did not see that any issue of political allegiance was involved, whether they were socialist, syndicalist, or more or less non-political. They were willing to work with Secretary Perón as long as he was willing to do things that seemed to be strengthening the labor movement and helping them, the labor leaders, to obtain better conditions for their constituents. However, before long, many of these labor leaders suffered a severe shock. They began to discover that it was not they who were using Perón, but he who was using them. They found that their union members were not giving credit to the union leaders for the advances that were being made, but to the Secretary of Labor, Perón. They discovered that to a greater or lesser degree, their ability to continue to keep the support of their rank and file members and to lead their unions had come to depend on their maintaining a friendly relationship with Colonel Perón. The loyalty of many of the union members had been transferred from the trade union leaders to the Secretary of Labor. Of course, there was a small minority of trade unionists who resisted the blandishments of Perón. These included small groups of anarchist union officials, virtually all of the communist labor leaders, and some of the socialists. With these, Perón and the military government were ruthless. Most of the important communist union leaders were sent to concentration camps in the far southern part of the country. A number of anarchists and socialists were also jailed, and others just fled into exile. The policies that were being developed more fully under Perón's presidency, that to come, such as making available to manufacturers credit, foreign exchange, and other resources, were started under the de facto government of 1943 to 1946. However, the wartime situation made them less effective than they would be in the years immediately following the end of the conflict. The military regime brought about another important reversal in what had by then become a traditional policy. At the beginning of 1944, it reintroduced the teaching of Catholicism in public schools for the first time since the 1880s. Although some of the military men may have believed in this measure as a matter of principle, the main motivation behind it was certainly the desire to obtain the support of the church for the regime. In this regard, it was quite successful, as became obvious at the time of the 1946 election. So as we have seen, for about a year and a half, political parties had been outlawed, censorship had been exceedingly rigorous, and leading political figures had been jailed or forced to flee into exile. However, in response to pressure from the victorious Allies, political prisoners were released, exiles returned, political parties were allowed to function openly once again, and the censorship was relaxed. The regime began to promise a return to civilian government through elections, although no specific date for this was named. The United States, for the first time since 1943, sent an ambassador to Buenos Aires. With the return of some considerable degree of political freedom, the opposition mobilized. Political parties joined forces to denounce the regime and to call immediate elections, and to demand the return to a constitutional government. This agitation culminated in September 19, when a March for Constitution and Liberty brought 400,000 people into the streets of Buenos Aires in protest against the regime. On October 9, 1945, power was seized by General Eduardo Avalos, commander of the major garrison at Campo de Mayo, just outside Buenos Aires. Seems like a lot of their revolutionaries coming out of this damn camp. Juan Perón was forced to resign all his positions and, after being given a chance to make a radio address to his followers, was placed on a prison island, Martin Garcia, the traditional place of secretation of the country's most important political prisoners. So now they're getting this constitutional government back, and they're seeing that their Supreme Court and everything else is, headed by a lot of conservatives. So the working people are starting to get a little bit weary that all the gains they made under the 2 years under Perón's moves, they might lose. So we go on. October 12th was one of the paid holidays which Secretary of Labor Perón had established by law. A fair number of employers hastened to put up notices after Perón's downfall that, in the view of recent events, October 12th would not be a paid holiday after all. See, as soon as they get a little bit of power put into their hands, this capitalist mentality, they'll even take away a single paid holiday from you. And, funnily enough, this all came about because America forced them to release all their political prisoners, which does what? Causes chaos. And this is exactly what happened here. And this is exactly why anytime America interferes with another country, with its globalist agenda, they always make it worse off than it was. For all practical purposes, they took control of the streets, particularly in the center of the city and into the working class neighborhoods. They demonstrated, they marched, they beat up some people whom they recognized as being opponents of Perón. So this is working class revolt now. And Eva Perón, his first wife died, now he's with Eva Perón, and she's a part of leading this. There's some union leaders that are part of leading this. The result was that the move against Perón failed. On the night of October 17th, he was brought back from Martin García Island, came to the Casa Rosaria, State House, and standing alongside President Farrell on the balcony, told the deliriously cheering crowd of his followers in the Plaza de Mayo below, "I have returned." He proclaimed that the following day, October 18th, would be a national holiday in honor of that fact. October 17th meant the political coming of age of the Argentine organized labor movement. The workers had successfully defied the military. They had forced the army and navy leaders who had ousted Perón to back down, to bring him back to power. and to go into oblivion themselves. October 17th meant that the organized labor movement had become one of the two major groups upon which political power would rest in Argentina henceforth. Juan Perón learned the lesson of October 17th well. He knew full well thereafter that his power rested on the maintaining the loyalty of both the organized working class and the leadership of the armed forces. Meanwhile, the opposition parties had all joined forces to set up what they called Union Democratia, Democratic Union. The radical, socialist, progressive Democrat, and communist parties, the usual suspects, formerly belonged to the Democratic Union. And the National Democrat, or Conservative Party, threw its backing to the coalition without actually joining it. Perón, in contrast, talked almost solely about social and economic questions. He pointed with pride to the labor and social legislation for which he had been responsible as Secretary of Labor. Perón also received some help, albeit inadvertently and unintentionally, from the U.S. government. In the midst of the campaign, Braden, who was an American diplomat who first went back to Argentina, by then back home and serving as Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, had the State Department publish the so-called Blue Book, which recounted the supposed links of Perón and his fellow officers with the Nazis before and during World War II. Perón, however, turned the Blue Book into his advantage. He denounced it as foreign intervention in the Argentine electoral process and pictured the voters as having a choice of supporting Perón or supporting Braden. The campaign was a rough one. Both presidential nominees were shot at upon occasion, although without effect. They were booed and heckled as well as cheered by their audiences. Nominees of both camps traveled widely and long throughout the country. Juan Perón won the presidency by about 54% of the vote on February 24, 1946. However, his supporters did much better than that in Congress. They obtained a 2/3 majority in the chambers of deputies and subsequently won all but 2 seats in the Senate, where election was by the provincial legislators, as had been the case in the United States before 1913. Juan Perón took the office of president for the first time on June 4, 1946. Perón came to power under exceptionally favorable circumstances. He had won a free and honest election, in which he had received a clear and substantial majority. His partisans controlled almost 2/3 of one house of Congress and all but 2 seats in the other. He had the strong support of the new force which he had brought massively into politics, the organized labor movement. The infrastructure of the Argentine economy was in reasonably good shape, with the country having Latin America's largest railroad system and a comparatively new highway system, constructed during the 1930s. Its industries had grown substantially in recent years, and the prospects for their further expansion, with the help of Perón's government, were good. Internationally, too, the position facing the Perón government was highly favorable. The U.S. government, feeling severely chastised by the failure of the Blue Book's publication to prevent Perón's election, hastened to send a new ambassador whose job it was to mend the fences with Perón as rapidly as possible. The British had lost their former ability to coerce Argentina with threats not to buy her food, which Britain now needed desperately. Britain probably being one of the only countries to win a war and be worse off for it. The Soviet Union, at that point, represented absolutely no threat to Argentina. Even Argentina's great rival within South America, Brazil, was too busy with its own internal problems to constitute any threat in the foreseeable future for its southern neighbor. Despite the upside in the economic situation in Argentina, there were still complaints about the authoritarian grip over the government. These included destruction of freedom of press, persecution of the leaders of opposition, gerrymandering and election rigging, expansion of the activities of the secret police, destruction of autonomy of the labor movement, regimentation of the universities and of education in general. During the years following his election, various methods were used to end the freedom of press. Health inspectors closed the printing plant of the Socialist Weekly, and they did the same with any printing plant where the Socialists sought to publish their paper. Eva Perón organized a publishing firm, and through various kinds of blackmail, forced owners of a number of newspapers to sell out to her company. The daily newspaper, La Prensa, was taken over through a more sophisticated procedure. The New Dealers, Union of Buenos Aires, presented the paper with a series of demands, including such impossible things as giving it control of the sale of the paper's classified ads, one of La Prensa's main source of revenue. Large numbers of smaller papers, especially in the provinces, were closed by another maneuver. Shortly before the beginning of the year 1952, centenary of the death of José de San Martin, the George Washington of Argentina, the government issued a decree that all papers must carry under the masthead the slogan, Year of the Liberator San Martin. But this order was disclosed only to Peronista papers, and scores of small publications that had not been notified were reported to have been closed down on the grounds that they had violated the decree. By the end of Perón's first term, there were no anti-government papers still being published in Argentina. Those publications which were not openly pro-Perón were neutral. At the same time that the Perón government was suppressing the opposition press, it was also mounting a persecution of leaders of the opposition. Many were jailed, such as Juan Antonio Solari, Secretary General of the Socialist Party, and Cipriano Reyes, who broke with Perón soon after he became president and organized his own opposition party. Other such radicals were driven into exile. The universities were more difficult to deal with than the organized labor movement. From the inception of the military regime in 1943, 6 national universities were the center of opposition to the government. Both professors and students protested against the oppressive acts of the de facto regime and continued to oppose the Perón government. Perón used various tactics to try and curb the universities. New laws were enacted depriving the institution of higher learning of autonomy which they had enjoyed since the end of World War I. The process of purging the faculties that had started under the de facto government was continued by President Perón. Perón's direct instruments of political control during his first period in power were the Partido Peronista, the Peronista Party, and the Partido Peronista Femenino, Women's Peronista Party. They were directly under the control of the president and his wife, and after Evita's death, both were dominated by Perón himself. Let's get into a little bit, real quick, of the principles they set up for his organization, what they call justicialism. The 20 fundamental truths of justicialism. Number 1, true democracy is one where the government does what the people want and defends only one interest, the people. Number 2, Peronism is popular in essence. All political circles are anti-popular and for this reason are not Peronist. The Peronist works for the movement. Whoever in its name serves a circle or a caudillo is one only in name. 4, for Peronism there exists only one class of men, workers. 5, in the new Argentina, work is a right that creates human dignity and is a duty, for it is right that everyone produce at least what he consumes. 6, for a good Peronist, there can be nothing better than another Peronist. 7, no Peronist should feel himself more than he is, or less than he should be. When a Peronist begins to feel himself to be more than he is, he begins to convert himself into an oligarch. 8, in political action, the scale of values of every Peronist is in the following. First, the fatherland, then the movement, and then the men. 9, for us, politics are not an end, rather only a means for the good of the fatherland, which is happiness of its children and national greatness. 10, two arms of Peronism are social justice and social assistance. With them we embrace the people in justice and love. 11, Peronism wants national unity and not struggle. It wants heroes and not martyrs. 12, in the new Argentina, children are the only privileged ones. 13, a government without a doctrine is a body without a soul. For this reason, Peronism has its own political, economic, and social doctrine, which is justicialism. 14. Justicialism is a new philosophy of life that is simple, practical, popular, profoundly Christian, and profoundly popular. 15. As a political doctrine, justicialism realizes the equilibrium between the rights of the individual and those of the community. 16. As economic doctrine, justicialism realizes the social economy, placing capital at the service of the economy and the latter at the service of the social well-being. 17. As a social doctrine, justicialism realizes social justice, which gives every person their right to a social function. Number 18. We want a socially just, economically free, and politically sovereign Argentina. Number 19. We constitute a centralized government, an organized state, and a free people. And lastly, number 20. The best we have on earth is the people. So those were kind of the guiding philosophies behind what he was calling justicialism. So the Peronista Party emerged during the first year of Perón's presidency. He had been elected as a candidate of 3 different parties organized for the particular purpose of backing him: the Partido Laborista, the Renovated Radical Party, and the Independent Party. Of these, the Partido Laborista was by far the most important, winning a majority in both houses of Congress on its own. In March 1946, several weeks before he was due to take office, Perón announced that the 3 parties which had supported his election should be merged into a single Partido Uncio de la Revolución Argentina, single party of Argentine Revolution. He made this announcement without consulting the leaders of the 3 parties or obtaining their approval for the move. During the first years of her husband's presidency, Evita now, she conducted a radio program supporting the government's programs and arguing strongly in favor of women's suffrage, which did not yet exist in Argentina. With the new Peronista Constitution of 1949, votes for women became a reality, and Evita set about to organize the government's female supporters in the new Partido Peronista Femenino, the groundwork which she had already laid. Although the ideas of justicialism always remained a little murky, Perón and his supporters pictured them as constituting a third position between capitalism and communism, between idealism and materialism, between individualism and collectivism. All this would seem to tell more what justicialism was not than what it was. It remains true that in spite of a myriad of attempts by Perón, his more philosophically inclined political associates, and others to give firm content to the concept of justicialism, they were never able to picture it as a coherent political philosophy. And that really falls on him, as he was never really able to stay consistent with what the ideals were, and as we'll see, at times put himself in front of those ideals. Over the many years in his activity in Argentine politics, Perón at different times appealed to the military elitism, disdain for militarism, working class syndicalism, social Catholicism, anti-clericalism, and various other themes. However, these desperate and sometimes contradictory ideas were never really integrated into a consistent philosophical context. In fact, the only theme which seems to be consistent throughout Perón's political career is that of Argentine nationalism. A major element of the economic policy of the Perón government again was to draw upon the resources of the agricultural and grazing sectors to effect the expansion of other parts of the country's economy. The IAPI, Argentine Institute of Production and Exchange, it was given a function of buying up the country's output of grain and meat and selling it domestically and abroad. Perón's original justification for the IAPI was that it was designed to avoid being taken advantage of by Argentina's foreign buyers, as he claimed had occurred after World War I. Through having a single seller of Argentina's products, the country would be able to strike the most advantageous deals possible with those abroad who wanted to purchase them. In practice, however, Perón used the IAPI to drain resources from agriculture and grazing for other purposes. Those purposes were several. Some of the substantial foreign exchange resources obtained from the sale of meat and grains was made available to industrialists to import machinery and other equipment that they lacked, so building up the industrial infrastructure. Some was also used to bring in requirements for such government projects as a gas pipeline that was built from the southern oil fields to the Buenos Aires area, and to open new coal mines in the Rio Turbio region. During most of his time in power, Perón had the IAPI pay the agriculturists and graziers prices for their products that were so low that they damaged the rural sector of the economy. Large numbers of rural entrepreneurs, particularly smaller ones, withdrew from agriculture altogether. The amount of land under cultivation was reduced substantially during his period in office. The agriculturists were not provided the means with which to replace the worn-out equipment. Thus, a major crisis was provoked in Argentine agriculture. That's something I think he's leaving out is with, that's the author of this book, is also with the growth of industrialization, the agricultural community starts to shrink. I mean, it happens everywhere that gets industrialized. The decline in agriculture was a major factor in the foreign exchange difficulties that Perón faced in the last years of his regime. The situation was intensified by the fact that some of IAPI's income was used for subsidies to keep the prices of meat, bread, and other essential products relatively low in Argentina itself. So he centralized the export-import, but because of that, sounds like you're going to have some squabbles with people thinking they're being undervalued, is what Alexander's getting across here. But at the same time, you have lower prices for food for Argentinians. You're building the industrial infrastructure of it by using some of the profits to bring in more modernized machinery. As he goes on to say, there is no doubt that an important contribution was made to the industrialization of the country by the use of foreign exchange resources by the IAPI. This was reinforced by the Industrial Bank, which the Perón administration used to make sizable peso loans to manufacturers who found it difficult to get long-term loans from the private banking system. Further encouragement was given to industrialization by the enactment for the first time of relatively high protective tariffs. Most of the firms in these sectors were privately owned. However, one major area of expansion of heavy industry in these years was railroad equipment. The railroads were acquired by the regime, and thereafter they mounted a substantial capacity to produce their own rolling stock and other requirements. One major project was the establishment of a new steel plant under the control of the military's Department of Military Equipment. In the Buenos Aires provincial town of San Nicolas, the government received a substantial loan from the U.S. government's Export-Import Bank for this project. Several other heavy industry projects were set up in and near the city of Cordoba. These included a plant to produce agricultural equipment mounted by the Italian firm of Fiat and the Argentine government, and a plant for building small airplanes. The most important project in the Cordoba area was a new automobile plant. This was built by Industrias Kaiser Argentinas, a firm in which the Kaiser Corporation of the United States was in partnership with Jorge Antonio, a somewhat mysterious Argentine entrepreneur who prospered in the later years of the Perón regime. It was widely believed that Jorge Antonio was in fact acting on behalf of Perón himself. The Kaiser's firm contribution to this new industry, aside from management skills, was all of the equipment of a large plant in the vicinity of Detroit, which Kaiser had constructed during its ill-fated attempt to break into the U.S. auto industry. Also, in his pursuit of nationalization, he attempted to buy back some of the industry that was foreign-owned or foreign-created. Perón decided to use some of the country's blocked credits to buy back British investments in Argentina. In the process, he repatriated virtually all of the outstanding government debt in pounds sterling and bought back the British-owned railroads and a number of less important British investments in the country. He also used some of the credits in France to repatriate French investments as well. As a result of all these measures, virtually all foreign investments except those of U.S. investors, only a few of which were bought out, were transferred into Argentine government ownership. After Argentina was forced to declare war on Germany and Italy as its price of becoming a founding member of the United Nations in early 1945, the Argentine government had taken over all Italian and German investments as enemy property. They remained under government control for a decade and a half. The main area in which new legislation was passed was that of agricultural labor. 3 different laws were enacted in this sector. The law provided minimum wages, paid vacations, 1 day's rest per week, and other benefits for workers who were employed full-time on the nation's estancias and farms. One social area in which the Perón government made considerable change was that of education, particularly on the university level. For the first time, the universities were made accessible to virtually any student completing his or her secondary school education. As a result, the university student population increased manyfold during the years of the Perón's presidency. And yet, we've seen this happen before, that you increase education, but you have a bunch of lefties teaching these kids, so you end up growing the market of dissidents. The new Constitution made several important political changes. The Constitution of 1853 had provided that the President of the Republic could not be immediately re-elected. The Perón Constitution eliminated this provision, thus facilitating Perón's re-election in late 1951. Other provisions strengthened the position of the military by submitting civilians to a trial by court-martial in certain cases, and broadened the powers of the government to suspend constitutional guarantees of citizens' rights. The new Constitution also guaranteed women the right to vote. The parts of the new document of which Perón was obviously more proud were those that incorporated the social aspects of the Perón Revolution. A special chapter of the Constitution set forth the rights of the workers, of the family, of the aged, and the right to education and culture. 10 specific workers' rights were set forth, including that of freedom of trade union organization. There were also 10 specific rights of the aged which were listed, while the state was pledged to extend special help to mothers and children under the right to education and culture. The state was committed to provide free education from primary schools through the university to anyone who wished it. So he's consolidating power, but at the same time, he is making a lot of good moves and gestures towards the working class of Argentina, giving them a lot of protections. The 1949 Constitution did not survive the overthrow of the Perón government. One of the first acts of President Eduardo Leonardi in September 1955 was to suspend it and return to the Constitution of 1853. Even when the Peronistas returned to power in the early 70s, they made no attempt to revive the Perón Constitution. So this was something that lived and died with him, pretty much. By the early 1950s, the economic situation of Argentina was beginning to approach a crisis. As a result, Perón needed financial help from the outside. The cost for getting this help, principally from the United States, was that he ceased his constant attacks on the United States and its policies. This he did. He had Congress ratify the Inter-American Defense Treaty, the Rio Treaty of 1947. He received a loan of $125 million from a U.S. Export-Import Bank. As a result of this situation, he was no longer in a position to offer general leadership to the other Latin American countries in presenting their grievances against Uncle Sam. Although his representatives often continued to be critical of the United States in international gatherings, as when they abstained on a resolution of the 1954 Inter-American Conference against the pro-communist government of President Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala, the Perón government no longer conducted a consistent campaign of attack on the United States. So America's good for that. We can buy people's silence. We can buy people's content. I'll speak a little bit about Evita here. We're not going to go too much into her, as this is more about Juan Perón himself. It seems to me that Evita Perón's role during the period from 1946 to 1952 can be divided into 5 principal parts. First, she was in control and managed the labor movement. Second, she organized and ran a tremendous spoils system. Third, she was the eyes and ears of Perón. Fourth, she reinforced Perón's popularity with the popularity of her own. And fifth, she gave particular attention to the feminine side of the Peronista movement, virtually bringing it into existence and supervising it thereafter. Yeah, Evita was really appreciated by the working class. She was seen as a figurehead of a lot of these movements for the working class, and she always made herself available by going to many of these functions and openings and gatherings, and was seen as a champion of the working class people. And she definitely in herself took it seriously and was much more than just the pretty high-class dressing wife of Perón. She died of cancer in 1952, And that definitely dealt a blow to the Perón organization. So much so, I mean, she was the type of woman where if Perón had stepped down and she became president, there wouldn't have been too much pushback. When he gets exiled and when he comes back and becomes president, his new wife at the time, he dies, pretty quickly after he's elected, and due to illness, and his new wife becomes president, and they just overthrew her right away. Like, no fucking way, bitch. So it's but with Evita, it wouldn't have been that way. I don't think so. I think she was viewed as a national hero to them, the mother figure. By the early 1950s, all the factors that had worked in his favor a few years earlier and had made it possible for him to appear as a great benefactor of the workers and the militant nationalists had turned against him. By the early 1950s, the vast foreign exchange reserves which Argentina had piled up during and immediately after World War II were exhausted. European agriculture had to a large degree recovered from wartime devastation by the early 1950s. Therefore, the demand for Argentine grazing and agricultural products was no longer as great as it had been a few years earlier, and the prices of the goods Argentina had to sell had fallen substantially. In addition, the impact of Perón's deliberate program of taking resources from agriculture and grazing for the development of other sectors of the national economy had begun to have quite a negative impact on the rural sector. All of this was complicated in the early 1950s by several years of disastrous drought. Although Argentina had droughts at various times in the past, in this case the effects were the most severe that anyone could remember. The country suffered a major agricultural and grazing crisis in the years from 1951 to 1953. Argentina was hard-pressed to meet its commitments for the export of grain and meat, and in order to do so was in fact forced to import some grain from places as far-ranging as Romania and the United States. So when it rains, it pours. The economy gets a little shaky, and then on top of it all, this severe drought hits their country. There were other additional dimensions to the economic crisis. Many of the firms which the government had taken over in 1943 were run very inefficiently and incurred substantial deficits. These deficits, of course, had to be met from a general government treasury, which was one of the several factors that led to the increasingly large government deficit and was a powerful impetus to inflation. The impact of this crisis was felt more strongly within the country. Shortages of meat and pasta, virtually unknown in Argentina before, made their appearance. Meatless days were introduced by the government fiat. Some cynical Argentinians commented that the government had converted them into canaries, explaining that grain hitherto used to make birdseed was now being used for human consumption. The crisis was felt too in the sharp drop in the standard of living of many people. Inflation had been kept reasonably well under control throughout most of the 1940s, and as a result, real wages had been able to rise substantially between 1943 and 1949. Now inflation began to grow at this disastrous rate. As a result, Perón could no longer encourage liberal wages and other concessions to all organized workers, but rather was forced to adopt measures to curb wage increases. The result was that the real wage of the average Argentine worker was probably no higher at the end of Perón's overthrow in 1955 than it had been at the beginning of his rise to power in 1943. A large loan was soon negotiated with the U.S. government's Import-Export Bank, and foreign investors were once again welcomed back into Argentina. The result of this was that before Perón fell, the Fiat Company had established a tractor plant in Cordoba, and the Kaiser Company was in the process of conducting what was then Latin America's largest auto assembly plant in the same city. More striking was the abandonment of the nationalistic petroleum policy, which had been an article of faith with virtually all Argentinians for at least a quarter of a century. The country was faced with a growing deficit in petroleum production, as a result of which increasing amounts of foreign exchange were being required to import the product. Perón apparently became convinced that the government firm, YPF, Government Petroleum Enterprise, which had a monopoly on exploration and exploitation of oil within the national frontiers, would never be able to make good of this growing deficit without help from abroad. So, having made up his mind on that point, Perón went to the extremes in the direction of encouraging foreign firms to help exploit the country's substantial petroleum reserves. In 1954, he signed an agreement with the Standard Oil Company of California, old Standard Oil, Huey P. Long's arch nemesis, Standard Oil Company of California, that aroused a storm of protest amongst the Argentine citizenry and gasps of amazement among oil experts in other countries. So this is like when he's totally contradicting his nationalist stance, because he's not only making this deal with Standard Oil, he is, as we'll explain, he is giving them everything. And this is all just to essentially save his ass. The agreement with Standard Oil of California not only gave the firm very extensive concessions in the southern part of the country, but also gave it conditions such as international oil firms had not enjoyed for perhaps as long as a generation. According to the agreement, most of Argentina's labor legislation would not apply to the operations of the firm. The company would be able to maintain its own police force to keep order within the area, thus almost removing it from Argentine sovereignty. In addition, the financial terms of the agreement were much more favorable to those in the vogue among the international oil companies. So you're essentially allowing a foreign occupation, a militaristic foreign occupation, as well as an economic occupation of your country. This agreement was seen by many, if not most Argentines, as a rank betrayal on Perón's claims to be a strong nationalist. Even the Argentine Congress, usually so willing to do Perón's bidding, for many months did not get around to giving the necessary authorization for the accord with Standard Oil of California. In fact, did not do so before the Perón regime was overthrown. His successor let the agreement lapse. There is little doubt about the fact that the proposed agreement with Standard Oil seriously weakened Perón's grip on power. It outraged Argentine nationalist sentiment, notably in the ranks of the military. It was undoubtedly an important weight in the growing balance against Perón in the minds of the leaders of the country's armed forces. During the last year of Perón's regime, there was virtually open warfare between the church and the state in Argentina. Some reflections of this were the arrest of many priests, the repeal of a decree law enacted at the end of 1943 by the military government providing for Catholic religious teaching in the public schools, the enactment of an easy divorce law, and the legalization of prostitution. All these measures were bitterly opposed by the church and were strongly supported by Perón, but matters went beyond mere changes in the law. On June 15, 1955, after Perón had delivered a fiery speech from the balcony of the State House, his followers swarmed through the center of Buenos Aires and put the torch not only to such buildings as the socialist Casa de Pueblo, the headquarters of the Radical Party, and the Jockey Club, but to 7 churches as well. On the same day, 2 bishops were arrested and were deported to Italy. So first, he built a strong relationship with the church, and then he lost that. And once again, kind of like the universities, when you build up an institution and then something goes wrong and now the institution has the power to turn against you and be threatening, I don't know, you got to factor these things in. So many things were not going right for him at this time, including the absence of a vita to maintain daily contacts with the people and to keep Perón informed of what they were thinking and feeling. The growing economic crisis that resulted in the reversal of a trend towards higher real wages to early lower standard of living, and the slowing down of economic development was another. So too was the sudden apparent reversal of the economic nationalism that had characterized the early years of the regime. Then finally, the sudden outbreak of a bitter feud with the Roman Catholic Church undoubtedly helped to weaken the loyalties of both Perón's military and civilian adherents. So all of these are accumulating on him. Drought, economy slowing down, he's striking deals with international finance, he's taking loans from America, he's allowing Standard Oil to essentially put foreign police in his land and do what they want with the land he was willing to give them. Evita's death. So eventually, the overthrow comes. The first of the 2 attempts during 1955 by elements of the armed forces to overthrow the Perón regime took place on June 16. This was an effort by elements of the Navy and the Air Force. With apparently very little support from the Army, aircraft bombed and shot at the presidential palace from a low altitude. However, after a few hours, the revolt was put down and the regime seemed once again more or less secure. Subsequent to the abortive uprising, there circulated various stories about Perón's behavior during the attack. Generally, they tended to picture him as having lost his nerve and as giving little or no leadership to the moves to suppress the insurrection. Whether or not these stories were true, they certainly damaged him politically. Machismo, or manliness, was still highly prized in Argentina, one of the last countries to give up the custom of dueling. And the widespread belief that Perón had proven a physical coward during the June uprising certainly tended to generate contempt among his opponents and perhaps even among some of his supporters. So this poor guy, he's just having everything come down on his head, and on top of it all, they're calling him a pussy now. On July 10, he gave a speech in which he pledged to dismantle the repressive apparatus of the regime. He announced that his objectives of the 1943 revolution had now been achieved, and now it was time for reconciliation. So now he's making another classic mistake. He had a certain grip on power, and now he's going to loosen it, thinking this is going to save him. On September 16, 1955, the second, and this time successful, coup against the Perón regime began. This uprising did not start in Buenos Aires, but rather in the provinces. In the south, at Bahia Blanca and at other bases, the Navy proclaimed itself in rebellion and seized control of nearby areas, while elements of the fleet steamed into the direction of the capital. General Amburu, in a conversation with me many years later, argued that what brought Perón down at that point was failure of nerve, not military defeat. He maintained that if Perón had set his forces into action to suppress the revolt, he would have been victorious. Only the outlying parts of the republic were in revolt. Their resources were severely limited, and Perón, having the bulk of the army still loyal, could have put down the insurrection. By the time he gave up, the heavy ships of the fleet were arranged along the Plata estuary and were threatening to bomb first the oil depots in the vicinity and later the city of Buenos Aires itself, if the president did not resign. This became more or less the official Peronista explanation for Perón's surrender. His own explanation to me was that he got out to avoid a civil war, which would have undone all that he had accomplished. But for whatever reason, whether it was to avoid a civil war, whether it was out of fear, whether it was he thought there was more people involved in the revolt than there really were, whatever the case may be, he went down without a fight. So we'll go into a little bit of his exile now. After several days of apparent hesitation, Perón finally took refuge on a Paraguayan gunboat, which happened to be in the Buenos Aires harbor. Shortly afterward, he was allowed to go off to Paraguay to begin his 18 years of exile. Shortly thereafter, General Lonardi arrived in the capital to assume the presidency. From Buenos Aires, Perón first went to Paraguay. However, the country's president, General Alfredo, whose ascension to power the year before had been supported by Perón, did not want to imperil his relations with the new government in Argentina, so he soon saw to it that Perón abandoned his first place of refuge. In the years that followed, Perón spent periods in Venezuela, Panama, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic before taking up permanent residence in Madrid, in the capital of Franco, Spain. There he remained with slight interruption until he returned to his native country in 1973. Perón was in the Spanish capital for almost 15 years. His opponents spread the story that he lived there in great luxury. However, this is more fiction than truth. I visited Perón in a Spanish home in the 1960s. He lived in an upper-middle-class housing development on the outskirts of Madrid, in a home which was quite comfortable, but certainly not luxurious. He had several servants. His house was protected by guards, presumably armed, and inside the house, too, there were several men who appeared to be bodyguards. So even far away from Argentina and Spain, he still had pull, especially with the Peronist government, or people running for government. He would often back and choose who would be the leading person, and at least give his opinion, and it was highly respected. In fact, even at times, he would get jealous over people he think that would overshadow him. So there was even times where he started petty rivalries even within his own party. But the whole time he was gone, there was about 13 coup d'etats that took place in Argentina. So obviously not stable at all. So that chaotic situation, of course, opened the door to Perón coming back. So we jump ahead to that. In retrospect, it is clear that the chain of events which ultimately brought Juan Perón back to Argentina and then back to power began in May and June 1969. The Cordobazo that took place then brought into the Argentine political picture a kind of civilian violence that had not existed before, and began the process of convincing the military that it had failed in its most recent attempt to govern the nation, and that it would have to turn the power over to an elected successor, even if he might be Juan Domingo Perón. What the Argentines still call the Cordobazo was a widespread movement of protest against the economic and other policies of the military government of President General Juan Carlos Onganía, although it was centered on Cordoba. It also took place in Rosario and several other smaller cities. The Cordobazo began as a series of student and worker strikes. These had the support of most of the important unions in Cordoba, as well as the principal student organizations. They were also backed by the underground Peronista movement, as well as various other radical groups that had some degree of influence in Cordoba organized labor, particularly the Trotskyites. Strikes became demonstrations that turned into full-scale riots. In fact, the movement in Cordoba, Rosario, and one or two of the other places took on a character of full-fledged insurrection against the Onganía government. The army was called in to suppress the movement, and it took several weeks for the military to completely put down the uprising. So during Perón's absence too, student worker parties started to romanticize his memory more, wanting him back. The youth did, and then you had the people that were there that were still his supporters when he left. So you had this interesting combination of young leftists and older rightists. Although the government was finally able to reestablish law and order, the long-run impact of the Cordobazo was very serious. As a direct result of it, one of several Argentine Trotskyite groups, the Revolutionary Workers' Party, decided shortly afterward to launch a parliamentary organization, the ERP, Revolutionary Army of the People, to carry on sustained armed conflict, that is, a terroristic or guerrilla campaign, depending on how one wishes to describe it. Now, this caused friction amongst the group, as some did not believe in getting into terrorist acts, while others did. The organization split, and the group opposed to guerrilla warfare ultimately joined with a left-wing faction of the Socialist Party to form the Socialist Workers' Party. However, the terrorist faction of the group, the ERP, began a serious campaign against the government. It conducted a considerable number of operations during the next few years, which included the kidnapping of a number of important business executives and a large-scale raid on a naval air base. In the process of its operations, the ERP acquired millions of dollars through bank robberies and the collection of ransom. The beginning of a deliberate and sustained paramilitary activity against government was not the only change in Argentine political situation taking place under the Onganía government. Another highly significant factor was a growth of sympathy for Perón among groups which had traditionally been hostile towards him. The bulk of Perón's backing since 1943 had come from the workers, particularly the organized workers. During Perón's long period in exile, they had been the ones who had stuck with him through thick and thin. In contrast, during his first period in power, specifically from 1943 to 1945, and for many years thereafter, the middle class, with the exception of some industrialists, had been generally hostile to Perón. This was particularly the case among university youth, who from 1943 to 1955 constituted the shock forces of the opposition to Perón and showed little sympathy for him after he fell. However, by the late 1960s, the situation had begun to change dramatically. Perón began to rally strong support among the university students, and the Peronista youth, consisting largely of university and secondary school students. The change was rapid and dramatic. Now, another general in power, although General Alejandro Lanusse gave as one of his reasons that he overthrew his predecessor, The argument that President Livingston had sought to make overtures to Juan Perón, President Lanusse soon set about to do the same thing, much more openly and determinedly than Livingston. General Lanusse's motives were undoubtedly mixed. On the one hand, it is clear that he and those closest to him had come into the conclusion that in the light of the Cordobazo, the growing guerrilla movement, and the crisis in the nation's economy, it was high time for the military to turn over control of the government to elected civilians. Although he doubtlessly hoped that this would not be to Juan Perón or one of his followers, he became increasingly willing even to pay that price in order to get the military out of an increasingly impossible situation. It is also probably true that President Lanusse hoped that in the process of the maneuvers leading to the return of the constitutional government, he would emerge as a logical candidate for the presidency and would be elected, like many others before him. He must certainly have dreamed of the possibility of striking some kind of agreement with the exiled dictator that would bring Perón to throw his sizable following behind a friendly but non-Peronista candidate. In this case, Lanusse himself, however, Lanusse was to be sadly outmaneuvered by the man in Madrid. Soon after seizing power, Lanusse announced that he was going to prepare the way for elections and the installation of a new constitutional regime. He announced that the political parties, which had been outlawed by Onguenia, would be allowed to reorganize, and that the new electoral law would be enacted. The Peronistas, of course, immediately raised. Messengers went back and forth in constant stream between Perón and Lanusse in the Casa Rosaria. Perón's own followers made numerous pilgrimages to Madrid. Leaders hitherto of anti-Peronista parties did the same. The public process of preparing the forthcoming elections took place against a semi-secret background of maneuvers and negotiation. Little by little, Lanusse was forced to make concessions to Perón and his followers. The criminal charges which had been lodged against Perón right after his overthrow were withdrawn. His expulsion from the army was cancelled. Lanusse announced that Perón was free to return to Argentina any time he wished to do so. The government disclosed where the body of Evita Perón had been buried, in a cemetery in Italy, and permission was given for it to be turned over to Perón and ultimately to be brought back to Argentina for burial there. The Peronista party was given legal recognition under the name of Party Justicialism. As one of the final ploys in his maneuvering, President Lanusse had written into the new electoral law a provision that no one could be a candidate in the coming elections who was not a resident of Argentina by August 1st, 1972. He thus hoped to force Perón to decide whether or not to come back and be a candidate, or perhaps to throw his support to Lanusse. Perón ignored this maneuver. He stayed in Madrid beyond the deadline and thus ruled himself out, apparently as a candidate. But he had made a strong point of the fact that he was not thereby endorsing anyone else. Perón would come back in November 1972 for the first time in 17 years. Let's get into the Campora presidency, who was also a Peronist. Hector Campora was inaugurated as the country's second Peronista president as of May 25, 1973. One of his first acts was to proclaim an amnesty for those who have been jailed for terrorist activities. He then set out about a rather energetically developing an economic and social program for the new government. In a message to Congress shortly after taking office, Campora indicated a variety of measures that he would be sending for their consideration. To deal with the inflation problem, he proposed to reduce some prices, to freeze all others, and to permit a 25% general wage increase that could not be passed on to the consumers, and then to freeze the wages for 2 years. To get the economy moving, he suggested an extensive public housing program, tax reform, reduction of high interest rates, and a development of a more efficient marketing system. He also promised legislation to regulate meat and grain exports, control foreign investment, nationalize bank deposits, and redistribute unused rural land. A commercial agreement was signed with Cuba, under which the Argentine government agreed to finance some $200 million worth of Cuban purchases of Argentine products, principally manufactured goods including automobiles and other vehicles, over a period of several years. Without doubt, however, the most spectacular event that occurred during Hector Campora's short presidency was Juan Perón's definitive return home. He arrived on June 20th, 1973, and more than 1 million people went out to the environs of the Ezeiza airport to receive him. However, the event was marked by a major tragedy, which bode ill for the future. Before Perón's plane had arrived at the airport, a shooting broke out amongst the immense crowd that was waiting to receive him. The exact cause or sequence of the outburst of gunfire remains obscure, but what is certain is that various rival armed groups of Perón supporters began shooting at one another. This caused a panic, and in the mad rush, many were trampled to death. On July 13th, Hector Campora and Vicente Solano Lima resigned as president and vice president, respectively. This move was obviously made to pave the way for the return of Perón to the presidency. The circumstances surrounding the resignation of Campora and his vice president remain somewhat obscure. It is by no means clear whether the original agreement between Perón and Campora had been that the latter would be the caretaker president until the way for the return to the post by Perón could be arranged, or whether Perón forced Campora out of the post without there having been any such earlier agreement. In any case, Campora's presidency lasted less than 2 months. Chamber of Deputies President Raúl took over as acting president of the republic. With Campora's resignation, the country entered into another presidential campaign. The list of candidates this time was shorter, with the number of those who had run earlier in the year endorsing the candidacy of Perón. Ricardo Balbir of the People's Radical Party was the most important opponent of the Peronista candidacy. Perón was only presented with one significant problem during the campaign. This was the decision concerning who should be his running mate. His supporters were divided into two broad camps, each which in turn had its own sub-fractions. The two main groups were the traditional Peronista trade unionist and the groups that had adhered to his banner only since the late 1960s. Almost certainly, if he were to choose someone clearly associated with either of these two elements, it would arouse distrust and opposition from the other. He was also faced with the fact that during his years in exile, he had jealously prevented the rise of any figure who might possibly represent a challenge to his own authority within Peronismo. As a result, when he needed one in 1973, he had no person who was his indicated successor as the head of the Peronista movement, who could, as vice president, be in a position to take over as president if he would not be able to serve out his full 4-year term. It was against this background of these two factors that he had to make his choice of a vice presidential candidate. His first idea was to offer the nomination to Ricardo Balbin. However, the People's Radicals rejected the offer, so Perón selected his wife, Isabel Martínez de Perón. She had no close alignment with any faction within the Peronista movement and was only clearly associated with him. She had the added advantage for many of Perón's followers that she invoked the memory of an earlier Perón, the martyred Evita. The ticket of Perón won overwhelmingly. It received 62% of the vote, with Ricardo Balbin, the nearest opponent, getting 24.5%, with the remainder of the vote being split up among several minor candidates. One economic matter to which Perón did pay considerable attention was the effort to attract foreign investment, particularly from Europe. Before returning to Argentina, he had conferred at length with a number of European, especially Italian, entrepreneurs, and he had hoped to capitalize upon these contacts after he returned to presidency. However, nothing concrete had resulted from continuing negotiations before Perón's death. Much of the time was taken up with political problems. Even before he was inaugurated, he was forced into a position of having to choose between his traditional labor supporters and those who had joined the ranks of his movement only in recent years. The problem had been present throughout the short Campora administration soon after Campora had taken office. The youth Peronistas had presented Campora with a list of demands. At the time, this move irritated Perón, who summoned to Madrid the head of the youth Peronista movement, gave him a dressing down and removed him from his position. At that point, the youth Peronista accepted Perón's rebuff with good grace. The removal of the head of the organization was followed by large numbers of self-criticism sessions by local units, in which the young Peronistas admitted their mistakes and reaffirmed their loyalty to Perón. The problem of the guerrilla or terrorist movement also had continued under Campora, and was one of the first things that Perón had to deal with upon taking office. With the election of Campora, those terrorist groups professing loyalty to Perón had announced they were ending their guerrilla activities. However, after some initial discussion, the Trotskyites, the ERP, announced that they were going to continue their activity. Subsequently, Perón moved strongly against leftist elements within his justicialism ranks. The police raided the headquarters of the Peronista youth. Then, after first bringing pressure on various state governors to remove leftist elements from their administration, he endorsed the ouster of the leftist Peronista governor of Cordoba, after that official had been removed by right-wing Peronistas and the police in March 1974. Now to Perón's death. As all this is going on, Perón had come back to Argentina a very tired and sick man. Even the official posters welcoming him back confirmed this. Although showing his hair still black, they pictured the deep wrinkles in his face, his hardened, leathery complexion. The smile they presented seemed forced, and one might even think that it barely concealed pain. He wanted to leave to history the memory of a man who had forged national unity rather than one who had to rent it asunder. During the months of his second presidency, there was a great deal of worry about his state of health. He was forced on various occasions to cancel appointments and to take to his bed for short periods of time. Rumors circulated constantly concerning the seriousness of his illness. The worries about Perón's health were probably as great or greater among the opposition than among his own followers. Accepting as genuine his gestures of reconciliation and his promises to govern democratically, the radicals in particular saw Perón as probably the only person with enough popular support to be able to lead the country through the terrible economic crisis that all admitted it was facing. They hoped and prayed that he would live long enough to overcome the crisis, thus laying the basis for establishing democratic constitutional government on a firm basis. They hoped that he could bring to an end at last a seemingly uninterruptible sequence of coups and counter-coups, a sequence that Perón had helped start as a young army officer 33 years before, and for which he had borne so much responsibility directly or indirectly after 1943. Although it became widely accepted that he would probably not live out the full 4 years of his term of office, it nonetheless came as a real shock to the people of Argentina when on July 1st, 1974, it was announced that President Juan Domingo Perón had died. He was succeeded by his widow, Isabel Martinez de Perón, who became the first female president of Argentina, but who also was replaced via coup d'etat. So she was ousted from government and she fled back to Spain, still alive to this very day, I might add. But after she was ousted, what took place was what they call the Dirty War. A lot of Peronistas were eventually murdered or disappeared. So that is the life and times of Juan Domingo Perón, who I think when we look at his body of work, we could say there was a lot more positive than negative. He did at times make moves that were selfish, and he did show, jealousy, a little bit of narcissism. But it seems that his goal was not just power for the sake of power or wealth for the sake of wealth, but he wanted to be remembered, and he wanted to be remembered for great service to Argentina. That seemed to be his driving force, no matter what mistakes he may have made here or there, or no matter where character may have failed him. That did seem to be his motivation. So that is the life and times of Juan Domingo Perón.